Hello everyone, I am Tejasvi and I take this opportunity to welcome all the speakers and the other participants of today's webinar that's being hosted by Wipro Foundation. Today's topic is learning in and through art, perspectives, methods, and practice. In order to facilitate discussions, I request all participants to kindly keep themselves on mute. If you have any questions, please type these on the Q&A box option that you have at the bottom of the screen. This session will be anchored by Roshni Ravi, who is an educator interested in conversations that lie at the intersection of nature, mental health, and teaching learning. She currently works as project coordinator of nature classrooms at Nature Conservation Foundation. And we have three wonderful speakers for this webinar: Arundhati Ghosh, Nisha Nair, and Sriram Ayer. Arundhati Ghosh serves as the Executive Director of India Foundation for the Arts. She has received recognition from several quarters for her work in the nonprofit sector. Nisha Nair is the founder and Executive Director of ArtSparks Foundation, a nonprofit that uses the visual arts and design to foster 21st century learning and life skills in children from underserved communities. Sriram Ayer is a writer, storyteller, and social entrepreneur. He is the founder of Nalandaway, named by the Outlook Business Magazine as one of the top 50 social entrepreneurs in India. He has received numerous awards and fellowships. I again welcome all the four panelists to this webinar. Please keep your videos on. I switch Roshni to kindly introduce the topic and anchor this process. Roshni, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tejasvi, for the introductions. Welcome everyone to this session, and thank you for joining us today. I'll just give you a brief overview of what this conversation today will be about. So we'll begin with understanding a little bit about arts education in India and hear from our three panelists, Arundhati, Nisha, and Sriram, about their work and experiences. We'll move on to talking a little bit about the potential and the power that the arts hold in the education space. And we'll discuss challenges in the recent past, including what sort of challenges the pandemic has posed and how we've overcome it, what solutions and alternatives lie before us, and also speak about the future of arts education in India. I invite the panelists to first begin by telling our audience a little bit about arts education. What does arts education encompass? What is its scope in the teaching learning space? And if you could reference your work and the work of your organizations while you speak about this, that would be wonderful. So Arundhati, perhaps you could go first. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Roshni. May I request you to, maybe the host, to take off the slide sharing at this point so all of us can be seen? Yeah, thank you so much. So yes, as some of you know, India Foundation for the Arts is really a nationwide organization that supports and implements projects in the arts and culture across the country. And through the various programs that we have, we try and enable projects across art forms, languages, practices, and essentially looking at what scholars, researchers, artists want to do, and then we support that. But the arts education program that we have is very special in the sense that we try and do much more than just supporting projects. It was started by thinking through how the arts and everything that we can learn from, not just the outcome of the arts, but the processes, the methods, the ways in which art is made, art is understood, art is experienced and enjoyed. Can those processes enable a more holistic, a more enjoyable, and hopefully slightly more memorable and remarkable experiences within the education sector. And as we know, in our country, education is a very underserved sector. Thousands of students, millions of students, very few teachers, infrastructures don't always are the best that they can be, especially in government schools. So IFA decided that we would work specifically in government schools. Unlike our other programs where we work across the country, in arts education, we realize it's so huge that it makes sense to work specifically in Karnataka. So everything I'll share today will be about our work in Karnataka, in government schools, and really in rural districts, and in the districts that, and again, as some of you know, we divide up our districts by high performing, low performing districts as far as education is concerned. But IFA works across all these districts across the state, and really in 3 key areas. And like I said, the whole purpose of the program is to see how best education could benefit from the arts. So the first, there are 3 legs to this program that we have. The first one is building awareness and ensuring that people know that this is something that can be benefited from, and not just see the arts as something useless that you do just to occupy time when there's nothing else to do in classroom. And we anyway know between science and arts there's this huge unfair comparison, and considering the science where all the knowledge lies and the arts is known as soft skills, etc., etc. Just be a little human so you can do a little arts like that. And so there's a whole process by which we build awareness across the state, by doing events, by doing awareness building programs, by doing publications, etc. The second one, which we take very seriously, is capacity building for teachers. So we actually do training programs where artists and other teachers who have been using arts integrated methodologies in their classrooms come and do training workshops for government school teachers. And obviously for that, we have to talk to the government, get their permission. But through the year, we do across districts in Karnataka, we do these training programs where there are 2 really things that we look at. One, that how can the arts be taught within the classroom that connect children to their lived realities and connect that to the curriculum that they study. And second, can all other subjects be made to come alive much more through processes in the arts? So that's what we do. And the third one, of course, is that we actually support projects in classrooms that do 2 things. One, look at curriculum that kids have to study, which obviously are books written by people who have no idea where the children come from or what backgrounds they come from. And then through arts, try and connect their actual lives, their families, the communities they come from, the knowledge those communities have, the culture and arts that are there in their homes, connect that in that classroom space. And we feel that creates a belonging to education, a way of learning that will always be remembered by kids. So broadly, that's where we work.
Thank you so much, Arundhati, for that overview of the work that IFA does. I especially sort of resonated with your point about connecting students' lived experiences, their own, their culture, and linking that to the arts education efforts and initiatives that you have. Thank you. If I can invite Sriram to go next and tell us a little bit about Nalandaway. Sorry, Sriram, you're on mute.
Yeah. Thank you, Roshni, for inviting, and thank you, Tejasvi, too. Nalandabhi works in 3 broad areas. For us, the purpose of why we exist is to primarily deal with the fear of a very disadvantaged child in a classroom, at home, and in spaces in between. And how can we bring joy into their lives where they're made to feel good about themselves? That forms the core of why we do what we do. And we believe that experience, exploration, and the practice of art provides that joy to them in the most non-violent, most participative kind of way. So we work with children from the age of 3 right up to young people at the age of 17 to 19. Broadly, these are 3 buckets that we work with, and all of our work uses visual and performing arts and design as the core methodology for delivering these outcomes. And the first most important is expressive arts, wherein it's the teaching of the art itself. One, we believe that every child deserves an experience of the art, whether the child has the talent for learning and committing itself to a certain kind of discipline. So we run programs, we only work for the disadvantaged children. So we work primarily in a largely in government schools to provide them the experience of being involved, dabbling, experiencing art in itself, which is primarily meant for middle school and primary school. The second thing is we run art studios in government schools, wherein we teach for children in the middle school very specialized various courses in visual arts and performing arts and filmmaking and design. The third, we also run choirs, which in Chennai Children's Choir and the Delhi Children's Choir, which are our music programs. But what we've also been doing is to support state governments and the central government in designing their own arts program while they're setting up their own curriculum and lessons. We do that extensively with the Delhi government now and with the Tamil Nadu government. The second area that is very important for us is especially in transitional stages, which is your age 3 to 5, which is 7 and 8, and 10 and 11 and 13 and 14. These are very, very crucial transitional stages from the developmental stages of a growing child. And we believe that a child needs to get its grade-wise and age-wise complete learning levels done, which includes also getting your basic fundamentals in academics, but also in social-emotional learning, its mental health, its creativity and well-being. What we do is to use the arts and storytelling as a methodology and pedagogical approach to deliver academic learning in these 3 important transitional stages. The last 3 most important bucket is to work on mental health, especially with adolescents, especially with children who suffer from substance abuse, trauma, suicidal inclinations. We work specifically to address those challenges, again using performing arts and visual arts as a huge approach to deal with and to work on specific issues, which could be on resilience, which could be on building hope, which could be on reducing disruptive behavior, substance abuse, prevention of suicide and such. I'll share more as we talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Sriram, for sharing the scope, the wide scope of the arts in various learning spheres and spaces. It's also fantastic to learn about the reach of your programs and how you've been working with state governments to develop these programs further. If I can invite Nisha to speak about the work that ArtSparks Foundation does, and a little bit also about, so what is arts education? And
absolutely, and thank you so much, Arundhati and Sriram, for it's always such a pleasure to hear others speak about the arts and education as well. So I represent ArtSparks Foundation, and in the context of the work that we do, I'll kick it off by just talking about what I think arts education is. So I clearly the notion of the arts or that term arts education, I think for all of us is all encompassing of all the arts. So it's dance education, music education, theater education, visual arts and education. For us as an organization, ArtSparks is focused on visual arts education. That's where our expertise lies. That's the domain that we wish to kind of, because we believe also that each of the arts is really important, and kind of providing a lot of focus in each of these domains can be really of value to generate research, to generate curriculum, to kind of generate more knowledge in that particular domain. So that being said, our area of expertise is visual arts education. That's what we focus on. Our notion of visual arts education is pretty all-encompassing as well. It's not just drawing and painting, but for us, it's sculpture, it's printmaking, it's graphic design, it's product design, it's animation, it's photography, really saying that the media arts is very much a part of the visual arts as well. So it's quite broad in its kind of scope from sometimes what we tend to see in school systems when the arts are broad. I also see the arts education as not just a tag on or add on to elevate other subjects, but I think, and we as an organization believe, that the visual arts education should be elevated and is just as important as every other subject in the curriculum, and therefore should be in the school day, should be something that time is allocated to. And just as we don't think about how can math help science learning, we should be not always looking at how can art help something else, but really look at the arts for what it is. Just a little bit more about kind of the methodology or the kind of the focus that we have. We, as Tejasvi mentioned, are focused on developing 21st century learning and life skills in children through the visual arts. We see the process of art making as more important than the product. And so the artistic behaviors that manifest as children work through the process, like problem solving, like flexible thinking and divergent thinking, the ability to hold multiple perspectives at the same time within an education system that's always about the right and wrong answer, but really to recognize that there are multiple possibilities, and we want to really drive that forward as well. Developing, I heard Sriram talk about resilience, and we see perseverance as a skill that how do you stay the long course over working on something systematically, coming back to it. So we're very focused on developing. We have these 8 learning and life skills that we've been focused on. We've also, from that has emerged also a focus on social and emotional learning too, and making that connection between SEL and the arts. And I think during the pandemic and later on when we have a chance to talk about that too, it became so clear that, these are the kinds of things that children absolutely need to be able to learn the behaviors that are needed to cope in an incredibly complex world that's constantly shifting under our feet. And I might just add also in the, and so we, as I also mentioned that we run creative learning labs within low-income schools. So I again heard Arundhati talk about government schools, and I think I mimic that sentiment that many of those schools don't have access to these kinds of learning, and the children also don't necessarily have access anywhere beyond what occurs within the school. So we're really committed to working within those spaces. We create a space, a dedicated space called the Creative Learning Lab. It's a school day program as well. And so what we're really looking to do is advocate for good practices in arts education, where again, it's not an add-on, it's not an after school, it's not that there's actual time allocated during the school day for making. I'll just maybe end this question with just saying that there are lots of parallel efforts as well that we do in order to elevate the positionality of arts in education. And so one of the things that we do with arts education is we have a professional development stream. We're really committed to building the capacity of other nonprofit organizations across the country, recognizing that there are so many wonderful organizations doing so many wonderful things and seeking to bring, other kinds of enrichment opportunities for their children. So through Wipro and our wonderful collaboration with Wipro, we've now had the opportunity to engage with about 52 NGOs across the country, really being able to spread that kind of understanding so that they may be able to build these kinds of programs We do a lot of work at the ground level with parents, and we actually bring in women from the local communities to run our creative learning labs as well. So we're trying to kind of shift mindsets at the community level too, in order to be able to build a better understanding. We also focus a lot on research. And so we really want to be able to generate research within the country so that one doesn't always have to look for art education research coming from elsewhere, and hoping that that can also be kind of a way to really push advocacy efforts forward so that we can, there are lots of signs of interest in arts education growing, but how might we be able to contribute in a more meaningful way? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nisha, for that really comprehensive idea of what ArtSparks Foundation does, and also an extremely sort of holistic approach to arts education in the country as well. I heard all of you speak about this audience, right? Who is arts education for? And really, when I asked this question, listening to the three of you, I think it's for everyone. So, when we talk about why arts education and, what the potential and the power of teaching learning through the arts, in the arts is, I think we'd all like to know a little bit more. So perhaps if you could, perhaps through an anecdote, illustrate how this works or how it would look in a learning space, that would help. Sriram, perhaps if you could start by telling us a story.
Sure. Let me illustrate this with something that we did recently, and especially around the pandemic, and where learning was, access to school and access to a teacher was such a big challenge. And much more is a challenge, especially with rural communities who go to government or government-aided schools, who do not have devices, who do not have access to internet, and you still need to have learning happening. So one of the things that we did first year, this is suddenly looks like lockdown has happened for, pandemic has been there forever. So it's, so the first year, 2020, in Tamil Nadu, specifically for all 15-year-olds who were going to government school. So this were around 6.5 lakh kids. So what we did was to use a combination of storytelling and art activities to specifically focus on their anxieties. That's at number one. Second is to look at how do they prepare and keep motivated to learn, to be continuing to be motivated to stay engaged with education. So what we designed was an IVRS based approach wherein somebody could leave a missed call, a call would be placed back to their phone. So irrespective of whatever device that they had, and they don't have to pay for it. Every day they would get to hear a story for 5 to 6 minutes. It was a story which had characters, somebody that they could relate to. For 40 days, every day there would be a story. Every day there would be an art activity. Every story had a specific reference to a learning objective that they would have. And at the end of it, they would do that activity as a homework, and for them to relate and reflect, and they could share that activities to them. We had one child who was from Thoothukudi. This child would work during the day. He would go up in the morning at 4 o'clock. He didn't have a phone at all. So he would go to a neighbor's shop and he would pick up a phone from them. This happened between May and June of 2020. So there's the first lockdown, which was much more severe. So he would pick that up. He would listen at 4 o'clock in the morning, and he practiced every day what was being told. And I was interested to know, because a lot of techniques, which was really scary for me, talking about locus of control, talking about journaling, some of these things, I really thought it's all going to go over their heads. But the feedback that we got, we had over 1.5 lakh kids listening to it on an everyday basis. And we had like 9,000 feedback from children. And one of this feedback from this boy from Thoothukudi really inspired me, because he was talking about mindfulness. He was talking about centering. He was talking about grounding techniques. And he was all picking that up from stories that he was hearing on audio. Now, the same continued in earlier last year, wherein we replicated this in Bihar, Jharkhand, and Kashmir, wherein we had like 1 crore children listening to these stories every day, 40 days. Now, so which means the reason I brought this up is that stories and art is a very easy way to bridge that gap and to make children excited about learning itself. So you break that barrier, that resistance, that fear. And second, today with technology, you can scale these programs. It's no more a small bunch of niche activity. You can scale this to an entire country, and it addresses important today's emergency needs. So my first 2 bits.
Thank you so much for that story, Sriram, and wonderful to see how, even when something like a pandemic happens and we're thrown a challenge like this, the sort of alternatives and solutions that emerge, from this sort of difficult space. Nisha, if I could invite you to share what the ArtSparks Foundation has been doing during this period. And also to tell us a little bit about, if you could tell us both, one, the power of the arts, in a classroom space, in a learning space, and also how you've sort of responded to the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. I do have some slides, and so I have 2 slides, but if we could just bring up one and I'll talk about it. The first one, at least if we can stick on that, that would be lovely. And so I think, if I'm not mistaken, Tejasvi, it's the next one. It's the next image. Yes, perfect. And so I'll use this as an example. So when posed that question about the power of the arts, there were a couple of things that came through my mind. And we always think at ArtSparks, myself included, of course, is that the arts have the potential to do something critical that other subjects in the curriculum are not able to do as effectively, and that is foster imagination. And so that's one aspect that I kind of noted down for myself, made a mental note. And so I wanted to share that in the context of this particular image, a painting project where we have the students think imaginatively about themselves as superhero change makers, and think about if they could bring a change into their communities, finding out for themselves, thinking about listening to what are the issues that they see from their own eyes, knowing that every child is distinctly different from every other child. And so they're going to have different perspectives of what they think a problem is, and really start kind of thinking imaginatively about that project. But in that process and that issue of, whatever the issue is that they've chosen, some chose the issue of, depending on the community that they were, or the particular area that they were looking at. There was one child, for example, who identified the issue of male police officers not listening to women and girls when there is an issue, and therefore the need for female police officers. And so the change that she wanted to bring about into a community was to usher in more female police officers by serving as an example herself. But in that process, kind of giving children the opportunity to use their imaginations to think of potentially a better world for themselves, to kind of put themselves in a position, envision out what the possibilities could be. The other thing that I think about that the arts, the power of the arts and the potential it has, is it kind of builds this recognition, and I mentioned this earlier as well, that multiple perspectives can exist. And so in this particular example, and we are very focused on this as well, as how do our projects generate multiple different solutions, that none of our projects should look exactly the same. 40 kids in the class should be creating 40 distinctly different things. And so that idea, because then what it does is it helps children build a strong sense of self. right? I'm not like everybody else. I'm my own person. The other thing it also builds is acceptance of others and that other perspectives can exist, that we all have differing points of view and we can really recognize that, celebrate that as well. So we really try to push that. And this also, again, kind of exemplifies that in terms of every picture is uniquely different. Every solution is different. How they've thought about themselves as change makers is very different. And then the third and last thing I'll talk about is this idea, which I mentioned, and it's very much embedded in our mission, which is working through the arts and the power of the arts to develop these thinking skills and dispositions. And these kinds of attitudes that are really kind of beneficial, not just in the art room, but they transcend disciplinary boundaries and they kind of go wherever you go. And so in this, again, this slide, you get a sense of that from the fact that, first of all, this is a large scale piece that the kids worked over multiple sessions. And so perseverance is fostered by coming back to their pieces every week, kind of thinking about what else might I do? How might I refine something? What more am I going to add? Investigation skills were fostered because all they were given were 3 primary colors and white. And about the 60 different colors that they created in their pieces, including the skin tone, was mixed and through in the investigation process, discovering the possibilities. The ability to think flexibly and divergently. When they were coming up with ideas initially and sketching out their ideas, they didn't come up with just one idea at the start. They played around, came up with 3 possible solutions, collaborated with their peers, got feedback from them, went back and determined, and then kind of honed in on one. So a lot of these kinds of ways that you can develop curriculum, they can really touch upon these skills that can really help foster these kinds of skills and attitudes in children. So this, and Tejas, if you don't mind, if you go to the next slide as well, which just kind of shows the same thing. The project was having the children create these shadow puppets. Every puppet's very different, the way they approached it, the imaginary aspect of it. They were coming up with these imaginary hybrid animals, and attaching a story associated with it, but just kind of exemplifies the same points as the previous slide and my points as well.
Thanks for both those examples and the the visuals to go along with that, Nisha, because I think it really sort of highlights how sort of imagination sort of plays a role in arts education, how it makes this sort of tangible and within reach. I also really liked how, I think through these stories, we were able to see how the emphasis was on the process over product. I'd like to invite Arundhati now to share a little bit about some of the transformative experiences that you all have witnessed, as IFA supporting and working with both children and teachers, in government schools.
Thanks, Roshni. Those were great stories, Sriram and Nisha. I wish I didn't have to speak. I could just listen to the 2 of you telling many more stories. I was just thinking as they were speaking that sometimes what this education system does to us is actually create an unquestioning obedience to authority and fear of authority. And so I half in jest keep saying our arts education program is not aimed at making good citizens, it's aimed at making critical citizens. And I think what we've seen happen through many of our arts programs, not just, and this is important, not just for the kids, but for the teachers who get involved in the whole process. And that's why we call it Kali Kali Su, which is learn and teach, because they're your collaborative learners with the children, is build a sense of confidence, instill a certain kind of courage, and also a questioning critical mind, where you know that asking a question is your right. And I think that's what ultimately makes you a citizen. Asking questions about what's your relationship with the state, what are your demands of the state, what is your responsibility, what is your accountability, but what the state must also do for you. So I think here the arts plays a much more critical role in not just your individual well-being, and everything that Sriram and Nisha said point to that, holistic well-being, but also your social and political well-being in any society. So for example, very little projects, so there's a project in Mysore that Praveen, one of our teachers, is doing, where he is introducing children to the idea of libraries. It may seem like a very little thing, but and to understand literature and the role of libraries in the life of books, and everything that you have in your syllabus as further references, further reading, etc., to go and search for that and to create plays around libraries. So, and create work that, and what does the space of a library actually tell you? And what happens is you see that children become not just more interested in reading, but they find lives within libraries, minds within these books. They suddenly take shape in very different ways than if it would if they were only reading it in class. On the other hand, many of these projects, what they do is they enable children to learn the folk forms of areas that they come from. So if it is Yakshagana, or it's Jiripada, or it's certain kinds of folk stories, or narrations and songs, and then introduce the text that they study in their curriculum and create little plays, little songs, little poems from using that text, using that knowledge, and using that information. What that does is that creates a kind of connection with that knowledge, which is no longer alienated, because the form of it is your form. It's a language you speak at home. Another very interesting project that happened, Nagraj Udeda, another teacher, he was teaching in a school where a lot of the kids came from the Gauli community. Now, Gauli is a language which is like a border language between Maharashtra and Karnataka. So while they studied everything in Kannada, the children spoke Gauli at home. And what he did is he got the kids to become researchers and go around looking for words in the Gauli language from their grandparents, their parents. And he put together a dictionary of Gauli, Marathi, Hindi, and Kannada. No, sorry, not Hindi. I think Gauli, Marathi, and Kannada. And this little dictionary that the children made, so they're very proud that they made this dictionary, was then distributed to all schools around the area where, and this is part of the language arts thing, where kids came from similar kind of backgrounds. We find a lot of the projects that happen in the schools where you either introduce, so I'll tell you about another project, Taranath, who is in Belandur. What he is doing is the kids in the 5th and 6th standard have to study about rivers. And they study it in geography. They also study it in their sciences probably. They study water, river, etc. through different subjects, but they remain segregated, right? Because that's how we teach. We teach different we don't even connect the subjects into thematics or anything in our schools, right? So what he's trying to do is, there's a river called the Kumaradhara River that passes through that area. So he is taking children to understand the life of this river through stories, through songs which are there in the community, through rituals, through understanding the entire flora and fauna around the river. And they are drawing, they are making little plays around it, they're writing stories about this river, but all the time also connecting it to what they're supposed to study in their class. But it's a bit of the curriculum, but so much more around that. And every time our staff go to monitor these projects, see the final outcomes in the school, the children are now they find a certain kind of confidence, because suddenly what was their culture is being valued by authority. What they didn't even know had value is now being valued by outsiders and giving it back to them, saying, ye aapki dharohar hai. This is yours. This is your resource. This is your story, and your story is important, and therefore you are important. So I think all of this happens in, the only difficulty is the moment a donor, or say somebody who may not be used to the whole process of how arts education happens, asks you, what is the impact on day 3? Because actually, if I read a book last night, I cannot tell you what impact it's had on me today. I probably can tell you 3 years later, but at some point I have to believe that reading books are good things to begin with. So doing arts, learning about the arts, learning through the arts is a good thing that we have to believe. Of course, then we can prove it through different ways. But the faith that the arts does good is something that has to become intrinsic part of education somewhere.
You know, if I may,
Sorry.
if I could, Arundhati invited me to join one of the panel for a grant making, being part of the jury. And I still remember that. So we were having these conversations about impact, evaluations, all of that. And I posed a question to Arundhati saying, okay, shouldn't we also look at, how do you look at what are the indicators of that this is working and what should we measure? And I remember the answer Arundhati said, if as art organizations, if we do not believe that implicitly that art works, then how am I going to convince others that you shouldn't think beyond it? So that implicitly art works.
Yeah.
So it has impact, it has outcome. You don't have to measure it outside of it.
Yeah. But Sriram, just to say quickly that on days that I feel more cheeky, I also say that the best things in life you can't measure. Try measuring how much your parents love you, or how much you love your kids, or something like that. I've gotten away with that with some donors actually. Yeah. Thank you.
Wonderful, Arundhati. Thank you so much for sharing all of those really crucial and critical points. I also really liked how you began by talking about how arts kind of foster critical citizens who question. And I think your stories also really demonstrated the power of arts integration and how how that works. I want to invite Sriram and Nisha briefly to talk a little bit about arts integration in their spaces through stories.
Nisha, you want to go first?
Sorry, I'm trying to find my mic. Sure, Sriram, thank you. So I think that, and I have slides for that too, if that's okay. Sorry. Sometimes I feel like as a visual arts organization, the visuals can actually really help. So Tejas, I'd be so grateful. Thank you so much. So I did want to speak about arts integration in the context of the notion that I just wanted to do a little bit of a comparison between what the tendency between traditional notions of arts integration, where the arts, as I had mentioned earlier, are illustrative of the subject that's being studied. And this is just one kind of example of a very illustrative arts integration lesson, where you're probably studying about pyramids. You're taking that and saying, okay, let's use an artistic medium to kind of create pyramids. Well, the kids are able to paint it differently, and so that's where the creativity is coming in. And the kids are creating quote unquote art pieces. But this is a little bit problematic, and I brought it up as an example of a problematic approach, because what I see in this approach is that diminishing of the arts occurs over here, where the arts is then subsidiary to the main subject that is being taught. And its only presence is because of, and the justification of its presence is because it's in service of something else that's most important. And I think that's fundamentally problematic, because the narratives that we attach to how we speak about the arts impacts how it's presented in the school curriculum. Arundhati had mentioned this when she was starting the conversation, which is there is a hierarchy in disciplines, and the arts unfortunately fall below on the totem pole, and you have the sciences and math up above. And I think that this kind of example of arts integration often fuels that narrative that's so problematic, that keeps those hierarchies intact. So the way ArtSparks approaches it, and Tejas, if you don't mind, if you can go to the next slide, is to say, and when we advocate for arts integration, is to constantly talk about how do you elevate the arts and give it as much importance as anything else that you're trying to integrate into the curriculum. So an example over here where in this particular case using photography, if you want to kind of connect it to language arts, the kids are having a robust experience with photography. They're beginning to understand all the different aspects of taking great photos from point of view, capturing moments of time. They have this really immersive experience in photography. And along the way, they get to understand that there are photo stories. And just like written stories, photo stories will also have a beginning and an end. There's also a kind of sequence of events, a plot, so to speak. There are characters that are involved, and how do you kind of draw those wonderful, rich parallels to the language arts, and then how the kids end up developing their own stories. And a lot of our schools, we also recognize that language needs to be taught in much more kind of authentic ways as well, where there are opportunities not immediately to jump into, grammatically correct sentence formations, but that you get to play around with language as well and quote unquote, get over the inhibitions and quote unquote make mistakes along the way, and talk, recognizing language development is not just reading and writing, but it's also speaking and listening. And how can these opportunities through immersive art making create those opportunities for discussions around the photos that you've taken that kind of contribute to language development as well. So just one example, and just my drawing the distinction between what I think are sometimes these traditional approaches to arts integration that we often see in schools, that again, I would say that there are some fundamental problems associated with it, and what could robust art integration methodologies look like, where the arts are constantly being elevated alongside everything else. You can stop the screen share. Thank you so much. Thank you, Tejasvi.
Thank you, Nisha. Well, that was a very useful example, how you made that distinction. I have a story to share. This is especially of working with disability, working with language and using music for it. So we run the Chennai Children's Choir. This is a choir which is an inclusive choir. So it has children who are on this spectrum. It includes children with disabilities, especially visual impairments. There's a child, her name was Anjali. Hope it's okay, I might take a couple of minutes more. And when she joined our choir, this I'm guessing was in 2016, 17. And she's a child who's quite someone who does not talk at all. And she's somebody who does not do well in a school environment, who's extremely sensitive to touch. But she was interested in music and listening to music. So her parents suggested that why don't she join the choir? And she was interested. For the first couple of months that she would come to practice, she would be along with other children. She would just stay around with them. She is not able to talk. She would just listen in to kids learning songs. After a couple of months, she started singing. She was just listening. She was developing language, which was in several languages. It is in Hindi, it's in Telugu, it's in Tamil, it's in Kannada, it's in Urdu, all languages which is foreign to her ears. But she started singing. Now, what was more important, and this is something that we say that especially in special schools, is that choirs is an excellent way for children on the autistic spectrum and learning disabilities to come together to sing, because it allows them to fail without being judged. It allows them to sing along. It allows them to collaborate while and working together. So she started singing together. Now, after 7 months, she learned to sing 7 songs that she could speak in languages. She's also understanding. She's reading. She's understanding. first performance that was there in 2017 end. And she goes to the Hyatt residency in Chennai, and it's a 25-member group. And Anjali, who is 13 years old, sitting in the middle, and her mother, who's always somebody who comes along, in the front row. She sings a song, and after singing the song, she would look at her mother and mumble at her. She can't speak anything else. She can only sing, okay? She would mumble at her mom, say, "Mom, look at me. Mom, look at me." That's a kid who's telling her mother that I am possible today. I can speak, I can learn, I can sing. This instant always gives me goosebumps every time I tell this story also. And what is most important, and I say it with a lot of pride, the Chennai Children's Choir went to perform at the Kennedy Center in Washington, DC. And Anjali was one of the performer in the middle. And this had a 3,000 member Kennedy Center rising up to applaud, and Anjali was there. So music helps language development. Music gives that confidence for a child who could just not speak or communicate to do that also. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arundhati, Nisha, and Sriram, for sharing such powerful and transformative stories and examples of how the arts can help and what role they play in our learning. We will invite questions from the audience in a while, so I request everyone to type in your questions or comments in the Q&A box. Panelists, Nisha, Arundhati, and Sriram, if I could invite closing comments from all three of you on what you see is the future of arts education in India. What are the gaps and challenges we're facing right now? And given the pandemic and the sort of unpredictability in school closures and access to physical learning spaces, what are some of the ways in which we can respond to these challenges, and how does this sort of the next few years look for you, both on ground as organizations, as arts educators, as well as at any recommendations you would have, at the policy level? So Arundhati, if I could invite you to go first.
Yeah, I think a lot of conversations today around education is obviously tied up with COVID and its uncertainties, its after effects, because the arts and culture, which are such sensory laden experiences, you can only do that much online. That's one. And secondly, the online space itself comes with additional privilege, accessibility issues of many, many kinds. I mean, we've all discussed this so many times in terms of hardware, software, bandwidth, opportunity for children to use devices, etc., etc. So that's a huge concern now, that how will you deliver arts education, and teachers, experts, artists together will have to figure out that if this world is moving towards a hybrid space, if that becomes our reality for some time to come, how are we going to handle that? That's I think one concern that has to be addressed, even if temporarily. The second thing I feel very strongly about, and this is where arts education plays a very important role, is the ability of younger people and the next generations to handle failure. And if you see the huge number of children that we lose every year to death by suicide, and mental health issues that we see among the younger generation, a lot has to do with their ability to understand and cope with or deal with what is socially seen as failures, or how to even define it. I think their arts education has a very important role, because learning the arts and practicing the arts, as any artist would tell you, is a fidelity to failure, actually, because that's what you achieve much more than you achieve anything else. And that failure is decided most often by no one else but you. You draw, you chuck, you tear it up, and you draw again. And that process enables you to understand life and its implications in a certain way. So I think their arts education again becomes very important to being educated. If education is all about coping with life in its different manifestations, then that's an important aspect of education that we can't do without. I think finally one critical aspect I would say that we have to deal with when it comes to arts education and its future is how do we make this. Our teachers are in huge stress, because of the hugeness of our curriculum to the limitedness of the resources that they have in the classroom. How do we make their lives, because we can go on saying everything that we want about education, but unless the change maker there, which is the teacher, unless the life of that teacher changes and becomes better, none of this is going to work out, because ultimately that is the point through which education happens, change happens if you want to see change. So I think role of arts education in changing their lives, in making their lives better, especially I would say, because we've worked for the last many decades, I've worked together with government school teachers. They do an incredible job. I sometimes seriously wonder what drives them. But are there ways of looking at both policy and honestly, the government job doesn't make it easier. Just when they have something going in a school, they're transferred to another school, or they're put on election duty, or their lives are a series of administrative hassles, if I may say so. And so little of their time they can actually give to what they love, which is teaching and being with the kids in the learning context. So yeah, can arts education play a role in their lives? So I would say these are the three things.
Thank you very much, Arundhati. Sriram?
So I have two submissions. One is a not so hopeful one and a slightly hopeful one. The not so hopeful one, let me go with it first. It's a tough uphill task, I'm sure all of us are doing, because the kind of challenges in the education system in the country today it's getting worse, and the last 2 years is making it much more worse. And it's also coming from a belief which is also problematic, and I think Arundhati shared that between, is that governments and NGOs like us are basically going to a teacher who's working in that space forever. We're dealing with some of the most difficult students and backgrounds and telling her, you don't know anything, I'll tell you what to do. Second is the same thing, is the child, you're telling him, you're an idiot, I'll tell you better to do. So that attitude of that teacher training and is really killing the motivation of a lot of teachers who perhaps give them the space and give them the opportunity to do something, create something for themselves. They will be able to do that. The hopeful part is there is a lot more awareness, a lot more commitment that governments are showing today with respect to arts education, at least the more pioneering governments. I see that extensively in Delhi, in terms of actively looking at art as an approach towards improving education and possibilities. So that's the hopeful part. I think what is important is, if we can not achieve everything, can we find small, simple attempts to make sure that every school at least does one play at the end of every year, which allows them to write, which allows them to create costumes, which allows them to create their own. So it's an interdisciplinary approach wherein kids create their own, and you have a complete exposure experience of doing something like that. Even as simple as, at the end of the day, for an annual day, they'll create and write and stage a play. Even if you can provide one task like that to every school, that will be so beautiful. I wish people, at least who are listening in this webinar, get to do this in schools that they have access to.
Thank you, Sriram, for that one really tangible takeaway and something that we can all kind of try to. Nisha, if I could invite you to share your thoughts.
Absolutely. Thank you again. Always lovely again to hear what others' perspectives are. So I think that just to kind of touch upon very briefly upon the pandemic, I agree. I think all of us have faced kind of similar challenges in terms of the displacement of children, tracking them, accessing them. Many of our kids, parents who are day wage laborers, clearly, being displaced from the city in the midst of the lockdowns and all of that. So I think that I see those as clearly the challenges that we encountered, but I strangely enough, during the pandemic, saw this kind of window of opportunity, and that I began to see schools talking more about the need for psychosocial emotional development of children, the recognition that in the midst of this traumatic event, more than addition and subtraction, that the kids needed these kinds of interventions. So we found most of the HMs we were working with were very amenable, including the SDMC members who were trying to track the kids with us, etc., recognizing that there was value in this. And how we reach the kids, really looking at for the kids who are in town, providing them with these art kits for the children, and fine-tuning the curriculum in order to meet the needs of this kind of distance learning, because none of our kids have the technology necessary. And the kids who are remotely positioned, we really looked at kind of more sustainable means of making materials. So how do you create, collage with leaves and so on and so forth. So really looking at what's around you. So that's just a little bit about the pandemic, but to talk about again, where I kind of see this moving forward. I think that there is, as Sriram mentioned, there is this opportunity because you see increased interest, whether it was the 2005 NCF, the 2010 white paper arts education document, or the new NEP that talks about art education. You definitely see that there's more conversations that are being had than when I was in school back in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. So that's an optimistic turn. What do I think are the gaps that exist, and where do I think we need to focus our energies? I would say that there's a need to continue to document, evaluate, and disseminate examples of quality teaching and learning in arts education. And I really do believe there's a need to distinguish clearly, define quality, and distinguish it from what it isn't. Because there is a plethora of stuff also that falls into the umbrella of busy work that unfortunately masks and, it buries the really robust stuff that's happening, because it again feeds into the narrative of art is just busy activity that you do when you have a little spare time. It doesn't have any real value. It's not bringing much. And so I think there's a real need to define the really powerful stuff from the problematic stuff and be able to distinguish that. And I also think there's a need to invest in teacher development and art teacher development in specific. I think there's a lack of pedagogical understanding of how teaching and learning in the arts occur, and there needs to be more investment in that. The idea of age and developmentally appropriate, I heard Sriram talk about that earlier as well, age and developmentally appropriate curriculum in the arts as well. What is appropriate for a first standard child is clearly not appropriate for a fifth standard child. And so the idea of clustering those groups and teaching them is problematic as well. And there needs to be more of these kinds of curriculum, efforts to develop more robust curriculum that's carefully sequenced and scaffolded and all of that. And I do take into account what Arundhati is saying, which is we need to really fundamentally rethink how teacher development happens as well, so that it's not bogging teachers down. Oftentimes they lack agency, so they're not able to make any decisions at the ground level. And so self-efficacy goes out of the window, etc., when you feel completely disempowered. So I think rethinking that, and then kind of thinking about how might we introduce more robust art teacher education programming.
Thank you very much, Nisha. Thank you, panelists, for over the last hour for outlining all of these sort of key elements in arts education, the stakeholders that we need to engage with. And I hope the audience has several takeaways, tangible takeaways, from this conversation today. We do have a couple of questions that I'll read out for you, and perhaps also one of you could address it. Meanwhile, someone from the Wipro team will also put out a feedback poll. So I request the audience and encourage you to fill out the feedback while you're listening to our panelists. The first question is from Nayantara, and they ask, considering that your organizations have a wide reach across the country and across particular states, what efforts were needed to decentralize your programs and bring about a contextual arts-based experience for the students involved? Broadly and conceptually, moreover, as a representative of an organization, what does one need to keep in mind while designing arts-based education programs addressed towards a wide range of socio-ethnic groups? Arundhati, can I invite you to answer this? And Nisha and Sriram, please feel free to add.
So, one of the reasons why for the longest time we've been working in Karnataka is because arts education is so, needs to be so context driven and connected to local arts and culture, that we believe we understand this. And that's the reason we've stuck to here. When we opened this program out to schools across the country last year, for which Sriram had come as one of the jury members to decide on the grants, on the projects for that. What we did is we opened up the possibility of what the arts could mean and how the teaching of the arts and the role that the arts play in education could be very different given the context of different languages, different art forms, different art practices. All that we kept in the framework was that you have a certain method by which we learn the arts and practice the arts. How do those methods make a difference in education, both by which Nisha has been talking about very strongly, the education of that art form, and two, what some of us do, which is looking also at how the arts itself can add value to all other kinds of education that you can get. So just opening that up. And so I'm not responding to the decentralization part, because to begin with, it is not centralized in any case, because there are just multiple possibilities within the arts, right? Multiple methods, multiple ways of doing things. And that is what is appreciated. So not a single story, not one dominant way of doing things, but multiple perspectives, even in the manner in which you approach arts education. So just keeping a foundation like ours has to keep this observation open. And that's one reason why we bring in experts like Nisha, like Sriram, who work in the field, so that also it is not just our perspective. When you're deciding on grants and projects, there is a wide bunch of people who come into the position of choosing what projects to go ahead with and what not to.
Thank you so much, Arundhati. We'll just take one more question in the interest of time. We have a question from Elakia, who is an MSW student from a college in Coimbatore. And they ask, as we focus on arts education with children, there is a need to create an awareness with parents and in the larger society. How can it be done? Nisha and Sriram, if I can invite you both to answer this.
Nisha, go ahead.
Certainly. I think that for us, I can speak to what we do is try to engage parents, even in the communities that we're working within. I think sometimes there are these false narratives that parents are not interested or they might not understand, etc. And we really don't believe that at all, because we see time and time again, when you do invite them to have a hands-on experience with the process that their children are going through, they themselves begin to recognize the kind of thinking skills that are involved in the act of creating something. And then they begin to recognize and we're able to help connect the dots for them in terms of why are these important, how do they use them in the work that they do. Do they face situations where they have to problem solve, they have to do X, Y, and Z. So I think that I would say that that's been the key for us, is constantly seeing them as an incredibly important stakeholder, seeing them as absolutely interested in understanding and knowing what their children are doing, and inviting them always to the table, giving them those hands-on experiences, those immersive experiences that can be very transformative for them as well, and help them kind of broaden those connections.
I mean, I'm just going to take just a few seconds to say, I think the role of parents have become much, much more important after the pandemic because of lockdowns and schools being closed. So which means the role of parents as the first educator at home becomes very crucial. So we did this experiment in Noida, especially when we were working in the Anganwadis there. And so one of the things that we did was to work with a community radio station, FM station, and commercial FM stations, is to run stories in the FM station, primarily aimed for parents and children to come and listen along, and also get parents to learn to recite those stories and to build on that and work with the child to do art activities together. So which means the role of a parent is very important. We need to engage the parent, and especially when we're working with disadvantaged children, the least support that they get is from parents as well, because there's just no educational activity that happens in home after they come back to school. So it's important for us to engage the parents now to make sure that they're also part of the learning process. We need to find innovative ways to do that.
Thank you so much, panelists and audience, for your time and for joining us today. I'd like to hand it over to Tejasvi to close the session.
Thank you, Roshni. And on behalf of the Wipro Foundation, I take this opportunity to thank the panelists for such a wonderful session. I thank all the participants also for the questions that you've raised and contributed to the richness of this discussion. Unfortunately, all of your questions haven't been addressed, and for that, I'm sure we'll have other opportunities to return to them. In addition, we have a monthly issue of Samuhik Pehal, which is a newsletter that we send out on arts education, visual arts education specifically this month. So you please look that up as well for more perspectives and more resources. So we look forward to seeing you at the forthcoming editions of this webinar. Thank you.